The night sky over St. Louis in October 1966 was restless. Wind stirred the trees along South Grand Boulevard, carrying the faint scent of rain and exhaust, as Nurse Carol Dempsey walked out of Mercy General Hospital for what would be the last time. It was almost 11 p.m. when she passed through the glass doors, exhaustion masked by a soft smile. Her co-workers remembered her laughter echoing in the corridor as she said goodnight, clutching her navy blue coat to her chest. The streets outside glistened under street lamps, the kind of glow that made everything look frozen, even time itself. Carol was 24, competent, fiercely dedicated, and engaged to Edward Langston, a young mechanic who adored her. Their wedding was set for the spring, but life in St. Louis that fall had other plans. The following morning, Edward grew uneasy. Carol hadn't called, hadn't come home. Her empty side of the bed stared back at him like a word left unfinished. By noon, he drove to the hospital, asking anyone if they had seen her. None had. Hours later, 2 patrol officers knocked on his door. They had found Carol's car just 2 blocks from the hospital. The doors were unlocked. Her nurse's uniform was neatly folded on the passenger seat. A pair of white shoes rested beside it, as though she'd calmly changed clothes before leaving. The keys were still in the ignition. Detectives Jack Ralston and Pete Morales took over the case that Sunday. Ralston, a veteran investigator with thinning hair and a reputation for sharp instincts, stood over the car and muttered quietly, "This feels staged." Morales nodded, flipping open his notepad. The car didn't have fingerprints other than Carol's, no sign of a struggle, no sign of forced entry, just silence. They began retracing Carol's final hours at Mercy General. Co-workers described her as kind, quiet, and perhaps too dutiful for her own good. One nurse recalled Carol mentioning she was nervous about a disagreement with someone at the hospital, though she hadn't said who. Another remembered catching Carol crying in the locker room a few nights earlier. Whatever troubled her, she had kept it close. Dr. Henry Alderman came under early notice. A prestigious surgeon in his late 30s, Alderman had a clean reputation. Still, during questioning, he appeared tense, polite yet fidgety, repeatedly adjusting his glasses. He said he spoke to Carol the night she disappeared about a post-op patient, but his timeline shifted with each interview. When asked where he went afterward, his answers became vague. First the doctor's lounge, then the parking lot, then suddenly, home by midnight. The detectives pressed further, but without physical evidence, suspicion alone wouldn't hold. Ralston quietly ordered surveillance on Alderman for 2 weeks. Nothing surfaced. Alderman went to work, performed surgeries, and attended community events with his wife Helen, as though nothing had happened. Public panic began to swell. Newspapers ran headlines like, "Nurse missing at Mercy General in shock." Residents whispered theories in diners and laundry rooms. The hospital tightened visitor access, and nurses began walking to their cars in pairs. St. Louis, a city already haunted by rising crime and shifting neighborhoods, now had a mystery that refused to fade. Weeks turned into months. Snow fell. The Mississippi froze at its edges. Then spring came, and without Carol, the police exhausted every lead, even consulting psychics by the year's end. Nothing led them to her. Eventually, the task force disbanded. The file was marked unsolved. Time moved on, but not for Edward Langston. He left Missouri by 1970, broken and bitter, never remarrying. Dr. Alderman's career, meanwhile, thrived. By 1980, he was Mercy General's chief of surgery, respected and adored by his peers. To the world, he was the man who saved lives. Yet those who had been there in 1966 sometimes noticed something in his eyes, a distant vacancy, like someone replaying a memory they couldn't escape. Nearly 60 years later, in 2025, cold case detective Lauren Hayes reopened the file. Technology had advanced. DNA profiling, digital archives, and a new evidence database offered hope. Among the forgotten belongings in storage boxes was Carol's uniform, carefully preserved in plastic since it had sat on her car seat. A small stain near the sleeve, once dismissed as rust, was re-examined. It wasn't rust. It was blood. Modern testing confirmed it contained partial male DNA, a match to samples taken from Dr. Henry Alderman during a malpractice investigation in 2017. The results shattered decades of silence. By the time Dr. Alderman was arrested, at his retirement banquet, The ballroom fell into stunned quiet. The once celebrated surgeon stood motionless as officers led him away, the flash of cameras reflecting off his glasses just as they had nearly 60 years earlier under the flickering hospital lights. Within those moments, one of Missouri's oldest mysteries began to unravel. But the question remained. What had really happened on that October night in 1966? And what drove a doctor, a man sworn to heal, to take a life? The truth, as investigators would soon learn, was more tragic and far closer to home than anyone had imagined. When the arrest of Dr. Henry Alderman made the news, Mercy General Hospital became a pressure cooker of anxiety and speculation. It was as if every hallway held its breath, waiting for someone to confess, to reveal truths that had lain dormant for decades. Nurses from the old guard exchanged nervous glances, their eyes reflecting memories of Carol Dempsey and the nights when rumors swirled, hushed yet insistent, beneath the hum of fluorescent lights. Detective Lauren Hayes, whose persistence brought the cold case to life, dove deep into the hospital's records. She spent days combing through faded personnel files and forgotten shift logs, piecing together the tessellated fragments of Carol's final weeks. Each page conjured glimpses of her routines: morning rounds, late-night charting, whispered conversations with senior nurses in the cramped break room. Carol's world, Lauren realized, had never been as safe as it seemed. In interviews, retired staff recalled a palpable tension in the fall of 1966. Carol had confided to a colleague about having seen something, though the details were vague. Dr. Alderman's name had surfaced more than once, tied to rumors of an inappropriate relationship with an unnamed employee. Still, nothing concrete ever emerged. Silence seemed the currency of survival among Mercy General's staff. A core group of nurses, Margaret Olson, Judy Rivers, and Elaine Cook, described the hospital culture as respectful but hierarchical. Dr. Alderman's authority was rarely questioned. Margaret, decades retired, remembered his exacting standards and temperamental moods. If you failed him, he could make your career disappear, she told Lauren. But outwardly he was a gentleman. People admired him. Despite Alderman's carefully curated image, some unsettling facts surfaced. Security logs showed his car leaving the lot just minutes after Carol's, contradicting his original statement. Lauren mapped the route from the hospital to where Carol's car was found. Streetlights cast pockets of shadow, and witnesses at a nearby diner recalled seeing a man in a white coat stepping out of a car that matched Alderman's, glancing back nervously before walking briskly down an alley. The more Lauren probed, the more she found evidence of subtle intimidation. A nurse named Pat Green remembered Alderman's veiled warnings. Some things should never be discussed, he had told her after she overheard a heated exchange. Others recounted whispered meetings at the end of graveyard shifts, moments heavy with implication, never spoken aloud. Meanwhile, news of the arrest radiated through St. Louis. Mercy General's board met behind closed doors, struggling to distance the institution from scandal. Younger physicians, many barely aware of the case, expressed disbelief, while those near retirement felt a mix of horror and relief. The city's medical community braced itself for a reckoning. The press hounded anyone who might have information, and the Dempsey family, long fractured by grief, faced endless calls and messages offering support or seeking details. It became painfully clear that Mercy General, for all its years of accolades, was built atop secrets. The old guard, haunted by loyalty and fear, had shielded one of their own. Lauren's investigation, propelled by technology and dogged determination, began to illuminate the hidden fractures beneath Mercy's reputation, a system designed to protect itself, even at the expense of the truth. Carol's memory spread through the hospital, her photo tacked to the message board near the cafeteria. Some who'd never met her left flowers. Others, burdened by their own regrets, lingered in the corridors late into the night, letting the past flood in. Carol Dempsey became more than a victim. She embodied every nurse, every woman who had ever felt invisible in the shadows of power. Yet the heart of the case remained unresolved. The motive. What had driven Dr. Alderman, a healer, to cross the line into darkness? Had Carol truly threatened his career, or was her fate sealed by something far more personal, more tragic? Detective Hayes knew the city demanded answers, and Mercy General couldn't move forward until the truth was told. With new evidence swirling and courage gathering among survivors, The investigation pressed on, determined now to unravel not just a mystery, but the legacy of a hospital and a city still learning to face their ghosts. As autumn settled over St. Louis once more, Lauren prepared for the daunting next step, confronting the man at the center of it all, and peeling away the final layers of deception that had kept the truth buried for so long. The interrogation room inside the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department was silent except for the steady hum of the overhead lights. The walls, painted a bleak shade of gray, seemed to press inward as Dr. Henry Alderman sat across from Detective Lauren Hayes. He looked smaller now, thinner than his photographs, his once confident demeanor replaced by a calculated stillness. His hands were folded neatly on the table, as though he were preparing for a patient consultation rather than a murder interview. Lauren entered with 2 folders, one marked Carol Dempsey, 1966, the other Alderman, 2025. She laid them side by side. The juxtaposition felt poetic, a lifetime between a question and an answer. "Dr. Alderman," she began, her tone even, "you know why you're here?" He nodded once, eyes downcast. "I imagine it's about the girl." "The nurse, the girl," Lauren repeated. "Her name was Carol Dempsey." For a long moment he said nothing. The air grew heavy. Then with a quiet exhale he replied, "I remember her." Lauren flipped open the 1966 file. "You told investigators back then that you last saw her in the staff corridor at 10:30 p.m. You said you left the hospital before 11, but newly verified logs place your car leaving at 11:04. Can you explain that?" Alderman glanced at the mirrored wall, avoiding her eyes. "It's been nearly 60 years, he said softly. "My memory might not be exact. DNA doesn't forget," Lauren countered. "Her uniform had traces of your blood. That broke him." His eyes widened, panic flickering before discipline returned. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "You don't understand what that place was like back then." Mercy was a kingdom detective, and kings weren't questioned. "You were her supervisor," she pressed. "You had influence, power. Did you use it against her?" He hesitated, then looked directly into her eyes for the first time. "She wasn't supposed to die." The room froze. Lauren kept her composure. "Go on." Alderman's voice trembled, the words pulled from somewhere distant. "She came to me that evening. Said she'd seen something she shouldn't have. A patient switched before surgery, names covered up on forms. It wasn't me who ordered it, but it was my operating room. If it came out, it would have ruined the hospital, my reputation included. I tried to reason with her. She refused. Said she'd go to the board." Lauren's pen scratched across her notebook. "So you followed her after she left work?" He lowered his head. "I just wanted to talk. She walked too fast, wouldn't listen. We stopped by her car. She turned to leave, said she didn't trust me. I grabbed her arm, tried to stop her, and she pulled away. She slipped. Hit the pavement hard. There was blood." I panicked. His voice broke. "I didn't mean to kill her." "I swear to God I didn't." Lauren's face remained expressionless, but inside, her pulse steadied with the rhythm of confirmed truth. "What happened next?" she asked. He swallowed hard. "I moved her body. I couldn't think. I carried her to my car and drove toward the river. I buried her near an old construction site off River des Peres Boulevard. It was muddy, dark. I just wanted it to be over." Lauren closed the folder. The story fit too perfectly with the evidence they had just begun to piece together. For decades, Carol's body had lain beyond reach, forgotten beneath layers of concrete foundation, her existence erased by time and silence. When the interview ended, Alderman was escorted back to holding. Lauren stayed seated, staring at the empty chair where he had sat, trying to reconcile the man and the surgeon, the leader, the murderer. Outside, the city continued its late autumn rhythm, unaware of the confession unfolding downtown. That evening, as the news broke, crowds gathered outside Mercy General. Reporters swarmed the front entrance, microphones flashing, voices raised in disbelief. Inside, younger staff members watched the broadcast from the break room. The past had finally invaded the present. Detective Hayes met with the Forensic Excavation Unit the next morning. They began scanning the site Alderman had described, now a paved stretch behind what had become a storage facility. Within 48 hours, a human remains detection dog signaled, and excavation began. Beneath 4 feet of packed soil, they found fragments of female clothing. and a locket engraved with the initials CD. Lauren stood there in the crisp morning air, her coat pulled tight against the wind. It wasn't triumph she felt, but a quiet ache. The weight of justice decades overdue. At Mercy General, a framed photograph of Dr. Alderman was quietly removed from the Hall of Honor. In its place, the administration prepared a plaque in memory of Carol Dempsey. The shift was symbolic, but long awaited, a reclaiming of truth from the shadow of prestige. The city's newspapers called it the Mercy General Reckoning. Survivors and old colleagues spoke out publicly for the first time, admitting what they had long suspected but never voiced. For many, the revelation reopened painful questions about power, complicity, and the ease with which good institutions hide terrible things. Lauren knew this case wasn't just an ending, it was a mirror. What happened to Carol could happen anywhere power goes unchecked, and as she stood by the excavation site at sunset, the Missouri River glimmering in the fading light, she whispered quietly to the wind, "We found you. Carol, you're home now." Winter settled heavily over St. Louis as the case consumed the city. The streets were quiet, blanketed in snow that softened the edges of everything, yet the undercurrent of conversation was relentless. Everyone knew the story: the nurse who vanished, the doctor who had outlived his lies, and the detective who dug the past out of the ground. Mercy General Hospital stood as both monument and crime scene, its lights burning late into the night, while investigators boxed up decades of archived records. In the days following Dr. Henry Alderman's confession, the media called it the most significant cold case breakthrough in Missouri history. But for Detective Lauren Hayes, the headlines felt hollow. Closure wasn't tidy. Justice wasn't restorative. She attended the forensic lab briefing personally, watching as the recovered remains were catalogued with care. Even in fragments, Carol Dempsey's story was whole now. Cause of death? Lauren asked softly. The forensic pathologist, Dr. Ian Booker, adjusted his glasses. Blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with the impact described. No evidence of premeditation in the wound pattern, but she did struggle. Defensive bruising on the forearms. Lauren nodded. It mattered, not for punishment but truth. Fighting back meant Carol hadn't gone quietly. The following week, a special hearing was scheduled. Alderman's attorneys petitioned for leniency due to his age and failing health, but public outrage was immense. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, former colleagues, and relatives of Carol who hadn't seen each other in decades. As he was escorted in, Alderman looked diminished, his body frail under the weight of his own history. Yet the silence that filled the room was deafening. When the judge asked if he wished to speak, Alderman rose slowly. His voice, though shaky, still bore the cadence of authority. "I took an oath to do no harm," he began, breathing heavily. "But my cowardice did harm greater than any scalpel could. I buried my mistake along with that young woman. And for 60 years I practiced medicine, believing skill could erase sin. It cannot." He paused, eyes glistening. "I am sorry." From the gallery, a single sob escaped. Carol's younger sister, Ruth, now in her 70s, clutching a worn photograph of her sibling in her nurse's uniform. The years had not dulled her grief. But hearing those words, hollow as they were, was the first breath of truth she'd been given since 1966. After the hearing, reporters swarmed the courthouse steps. The city's conversation shifted from outrage to introspection. Editorials questioned how power had enabled silence, how institutions had prized image over integrity. Mercy General launched an internal review, uncovering years of buried complaints across different departments. For the first time, accountability seemed to take root. Lauren Hayes kept her distance from the spectacle. To her, the justice system wasn't a stage. Instead, she visited Carol's burial site, no longer a numbered case file but a grave at Calvary Cemetery, marked with fresh flowers and a simple inscription, "Carol Dempsey, remembered." At last, the wind whispered across the stones, carrying the low hum of the city in the distance. She thought about Alderman's words in the interrogation room. She wasn't supposed to die. Maybe not, Lauren mused, but death born of fear and pride was no accident. It was a choice, and one made under the same arrogance that had infected Mercy General for years. That night, as snow fell gently against her office window, Lauren reopened the old file again, tracing the timeline one last time. It wasn't just about solving the case. It was about the message left behind. Carol's disappearance had revealed something devastating, that beneath professionalism and prestige, silence thrives where power goes unchallenged. Outside of law enforcement circles, the case spurred changes. The Missouri Medical Board enacted new whistleblower protocols. Hospitals began introducing mandatory ethics reviews for senior staff. Mercy General, humbled and bruised, proudly unveiled the Dempsey Initiative, a program supporting nurses and medical workers facing workplace intimidation. The plaque bearing Carol's name became a quiet shrine, where staff left notes of thanks and apologies. Alderman died in custody 6 months later. No obituary celebrated him. No eulogies echoed in the medical journals that once praised his skill. He was buried quietly without ceremony, his grave unmarked. But Lauren didn't see that as victory. It was balance, the universe correcting itself one truth at a time. In her final report, she wrote, "Justice does not heal the past. It only prevents silence from surviving the present." Carol Dempsey's voice was stolen in 1966, but her courage speaks now through every person who dares to tell the truth, even when it costs everything. When the city's winter gave way to spring, the Mississippi thawed, its waters rolling steady and wide through the heart of St. Louis. Lauren visited the riverbank where Carol's body had once been hidden. The skyline shimmered across the water, cranes and new buildings rising above old brick factories, symbols of progress amid scars. There, she left a small bouquet of lilies, Carol's favorite flower according to an old hospital yearbook. The petals caught the wind, drifting slowly toward the current. For a moment she stood still, breathing in the sound of the river, the same river that once carried the city's secrets, now carrying peace instead. "Rest easy," she whispered. "We finally listened. The case was closed, the files sealed and archived. But for Detective Lauren Hayes, the story wasn't about crime. It was about conscience and how sometimes it takes half a century for one truth to find its way through the noise." And somewhere in Mercy General Hospital, under the hum of new fluorescent lights and the rhythm of white shoes on tile, Carol Dempsey's name endured, not as a footnote in tragedy, but as a promise that silence, no matter how long it lasts, never wins. Months had passed since the courtroom lights dimmed and the cameras vanished, but the echoes of the Mercy General case still lingered in St. Louis, like a faint hum beneath the city's rhythm. Though the legal chapter had closed, the moral aftermath continued to ripple through lives connected, directly or quietly. To what had happened in October 1966, Detective Lauren Hayes had returned to her usual workload, sifting through a growing pile of cold cases in her dimly lit office. Still, Carol Dempsey's file, its edges worn, her picture faded from handling, remained on the corner of her desk. Sometimes she caught herself glancing toward it mid-afternoon, her thoughts drifting back to that fateful October night. No matter how many cases she solved, this one clung to her conscience, the perfect storm of power, silence and consequence. One evening, as the sun melted into a streak of gold across the Mississippi, Lauren sat on a bench near the arch, watching the reflection of the city on the water. That monument, symbolic and unwavering, reminded her that history has both beauty and burden. She thought of Carol's dreams, of the wedding she never had, of the career that could have inspired generations of nurses. More than anything, she thought about justice, how thin its line often feels, how easily truth is buried beneath reputation. Mercy General Hospital had changed dramatically. The corridors, once haunted by whispers, now echoed with transparency. Cameras in hallways, strict oversight committees, regular staff ethics training. The hospital had opened an education wing named the Carol Dempsey Learning Center, dedicated to empowering nurses through leadership and safety advocacy. Ironically, the transformation was driven by the same institution that had once silenced her, a quiet acknowledgement that progress is often born from pain. Among the new staff, many knew Carol's name, but few knew her story in full. Yet her legacy was present in every nurse who dared to question a superior, every worker who now had the confidence to speak when something seemed wrong. Mercy General might have rebuilt its image, but it was Carol's name that restored its soul. Across town, in a modest bungalow painted pale blue, Ruth Dempsey tended to her sister's scrapbooks. Inside were yellowed clippings of missing person headlines, photographs of Carol smiling in her uniform, and now fresh newspaper prints detailing the final verdict. Ruth had waited her whole life for those words. Justice served. But as she told a visiting reporter, justice didn't bring her back. It only reminded people she mattered. Her grief, though softened by time, remained a constant presence, like a scar that stopped aching but never disappeared. Lauren later visited Ruth one afternoon, a gesture she didn't owe but felt compelled to make. The house smelled faintly of jasmine tea and old wood. The two women sat at the dining table, the scrapbook open between them. Ruth's fingers rested on a photo of Carol taken just days before she vanished. She believed in doing the right thing, Ruth said quietly. Even when it scared her, Lauren nodded. She did more than that. She changed an entire system. Ruth smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. She would have liked you, you know. You two share that same look, like you don't back down easily. The moment lingered. Outside, wind chimes clinked softly in the afternoon breeze, the sound faint yet enduring. Before leaving, Lauren promised Ruth something, that she would make sure Carol's full story was recorded, documented, and remembered beyond the headlines. Ruth simply squeezed her hand and whispered, "That's all she ever wanted." The next week, Lauren began compiling her report into a detailed chronicle of the case, the evidence, the mistakes, and the final confession. She titled it, "The Mercy General Files, a 59-Year Silence." She didn't write it for glory, but for preservation, a record to ensure that what happened to Carol Dempsey would never happen again under layers of institutional denial. As she wrote late into the night, the glow from her laptop reflected off the police badge lying beside it. Cases like this, she thought, weren't just about victims or perpetrators. They were about the fabric of a community. When truth is buried, the entire society decays with it. And when truth finally surfaces, it heals more than the names on the file. It redeems the city itself. Months later, a small ceremony was held at Mercy General's main courtyard. Former nurses, now grey-haired and frail, stood beside new recruits in crisp uniforms. The hospital's director, a woman who had started there decades earlier as a trainee under aldermen, gave a brief but heartfelt address. "We cannot rewrite the past," she said solemnly, "but we can honor the ones whose silence taught us the cost of fear." As she stepped down, Lauren placed a single white rose at the base of the bronze plaque bearing Carol's name. The marble below it read, "Her courage unveiled the truth." For once, the hospital courtyard, once a place of secrets, felt like hallowed ground. That night, the city lights shimmered over the river once more. The story that began in darkness had found its light, though not the kind of brightness that blinds, but the gentle, steady glow of remembrance. Carol's story was no longer just a cold case. It had become an echo, one that would keep reminding future generations that silence, when broken, can change everything. In her closing notes, Lauren wrote one final line: "Justice is not an ending, it's a warning. A reminder that the truth, no matter how long it hides, will always demand to be found." And with that, she closed her notebook. Outside, St. Louis hummed with life. A city that had carried one woman's secret for half a century, now breathing easier in the light of truth brought back at last. By the first anniversary of the case's resolution, the people of St. Louis had begun to speak of Carol Dempsey not just as a victim, but as a symbol. Her story had transcended the confines of the crime itself and spilled into public consciousness, a reminder that truth, when ignored, corrodes from within. Shows, articles, and lectures featured her name. Nursing schools cited her courage as part of their ethics training. But amid all the noise of remembrance, Detective Lauren Hayes found herself struggling with what came after. Justice, she thought, was not the same as peace. Her office was cluttered with files and framed awards, though none of them brought satisfaction. When interviewed by local press about closing one of Missouri's longest cold cases, she often deflected praise. "This wasn't solved by one detective," she would say. "It was solved by a city finally daring to look at itself." Still, nights were quieter now, almost uncomfortably so. Lauren's mind replayed fragments from Alderman's confession. The trembling words, "She wasn't supposed to die," never left her. Every time she read back through the transcript, she wondered, if he hadn't panicked, would he still have gone free and respected? How many more Carol Dempseys had stood on those same moral crossroads, unnoticed? In her need for closure, Lauren began meeting with retired officers who had worked during the 1960s. Many had faint recollections, missing paperwork, unrecorded statements. The casual sexism of a time when female victims were often treated as afterthoughts. One retired lieutenant grimaced as he admitted, "The brass didn't want to ruin the hospital's image. We were told to ease off." Back then, that was enough to bury a case. It made sense now, the gaps, the vanished leads, the lack of follow-up. The truth had never been hidden by lack of evidence, but by choice. The illusion of order had mattered more than justice. Lauren wrote every name she could recover, listing not just the guilty, but those complicit in silence. She would never charge them. Time had spared them judgment, but documenting them felt like claiming back history itself. Meanwhile, Mercy General continued its public reckoning. New reforms were implemented, and a committee for ethical transparency was formed, composed mainly of nurses who had been silenced long ago. The committee's first official statement read, "Our institution thrived on silence for too long. Speaking saves lives. We will never forget that." Across Missouri, other hospitals quietly followed suit, introducing their own whistleblower safeguards. What began with one nurse's disappearance became the impetus for systemic accountability. The irony was bitter but meaningful. Progress built on tragedy. Among the people most changed by the case was Ruth Dempsey. Once withdrawn, she began giving talks at health symposiums and universities. Despite her age, her voice carried firm conviction. "The hardest part," she told one audience, "was realizing that good people stayed quiet. Don't be one of them." Her words received standing ovations, not because of eloquence, but because of truth gently delivered by someone who had lived its cost. Lauren attended one of Ruth's talks in the spring. Sitting quietly at the back, she watched as Ruth held the crowd with raw sincerity. When the lecture ended, Ruth spotted her and smiled warmly. "You came," she said afterward, reaching for her hand. "I wouldn't miss it," Lauren replied. "You're doing what she started." Ruth looked out toward the street, the late sunlight catching in her silver hair. "No," she said softly. "We're finishing it." Those words stayed with Lauren. Weeks later, she submitted her final report to the State Historical Archives, ensuring that Carol's name would forever be tied to the legal reforms bearing her initials, the CD Protocol, a set of investigative guidelines designed to safeguard evidence integrity in workplace-related crimes. What had once been just a tragedy had now reshaped procedure across the state. After work that day, Lauren walked the length of Forest Park, tracing the same streets Carol would have known in 1966. The air was warmer now, carrying the hum of evening traffic and distant laughter. Somewhere near the Botanical Gardens, she paused by a bench engraved in Carol's memory, a donation from Mercy General's nursing staff. She sat for a moment, breathing in the scent of lilacs. She tried to imagine Carol here, alive, smiling, free of fear. Some stories, Lauren reflected, never stop echoing. They just find quieter forms. As dusk deepened, she whispered to the empty park, "You changed more than you ever knew." Thunder rumbled over the river in the distance, and she took it as a sign, not of closure, but of continuation. Because truth once unearthed has momentum. It keeps moving, pressing, demanding light. Back at the precinct, Lauren pinned one final note above her desk before heading home. In bold handwriting it read, "Let no story end in silence." And beneath it, a small photograph. Carol Dempsey smiling in grayscale. Her nurse's cap tilted slightly to one side, forever reminding those who looked upon her that courage, even buried for 60 years, can still change the world. By the fall of 2026, the case that once defined St. Louis had become a nationwide reference, not for the scandal, but for its lessons. Universities taught it in ethics classes. True crime documentaries debated it endlessly. But beyond the sensationalism, in quiet corners of hospitals and precincts, people began to change how they acted, spoke, and listened. The ripple was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, yet unmistakably real. Detective Lauren Hayes had transferred from cold cases to a special task force focusing on institutional accountability, a direct legacy of the Mercy General fallout. She often found herself speaking to younger detectives, reminding them to listen to what isn't being said. It had become her mantra, born from the realization that silence is often more revealing than words. Despite new responsibilities, she couldn't quite let go of Carol's story. Sometimes between case briefings, she read old witness transcripts or stared at the grainy black-and-white photograph from 1966, Carol standing in front of the hospital fountain, her eyes full of promise. There wasn't nostalgia exactly. It was respect. The kind you feel for someone who unknowingly started a revolution by refusing to look away. Meanwhile, the city's pulse had changed. Mercy General was now one of the most transparent medical institutions in Missouri. The Dempsey Initiative expanded statewide, ensuring that healthcare professionals could report misconduct without fear of retaliation. The hospital's rebranding came with a quiet slogan engraved beneath its logo, "Truth saves lives." For many patients and workers, it was more than a marketing phrase. It was a reminder of the cost of secrets. In an interview marking 1 year since Alderman's conviction, the hospital's current director, Dr. Evelyn Malik, said, "Mercy General once believed it could protect its reputation through silence. Carol Dempsey taught us that reputations mean nothing without integrity." Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke those words, aware of how heavy the truth had been to uncover, and how much heavier it had been to live without it for so long. Lauren watched that interview from her living room, the glow of the television flickering across her wall. It struck her how time, though merciless, could bring about change when someone stood firm enough to challenge it. Carol had become an inseparable part of the city's conscience, a quiet moral compass that guided those who came after. Not far away, Ruth Dempsey sat in her small kitchen, clipping the article that featured Dr. Malik's remarks. By now, her walls were lined with clippings, each telling another phase of her sister's reborn legacy. She spent her evenings reading the letters people sent, nurses, students, even doctors, writing to say how Carol's courage had inspired them. She replied to everyone, her trembling handwriting steady with purpose. "Speak when you must." Silence was never strength. One autumn morning, Lauren received a small envelope at the precinct, postmarked from Ruth. Inside was a faded Polaroid, Carol seated at a picnic holding a coffee cup and laughing. On the back was a handwritten note. "For you, Detective Hayes, for listening when others didn't." Lauren swallowed hard, setting the photo on her desk beside her badge. She whispered, "Thank you," though she wasn't sure to whom, Ruth, Carol, or fate itself. The following weeks brought new challenges. A case involving another hospital cover-up crossed her desk. Eerily familiar patterns of intimidation and silence. This time, however, things went differently. The employees spoke up. The administration cooperated. Evidence was preserved, and truth came to light swiftly. For once the system worked. And as Lauren reviewed the final report, she caught herself smiling faintly. The ripple was working. Later that year, Lauren returned to the riverbank by the old industrial site, where Carol had been found. It was quieter now, the construction replaced by a small public walkway lined with benches and plaques commemorating victims of unsolved or reopened cases. The Missouri River sparkled under the afternoon sun, its current steady and reflective. Standing there, Lauren placed a single rose into the water. It drifted slowly downstream, past the metallic glint of bridges and under the shadows of passing clouds. She thought about what justice really meant. It wasn't a verdict or even an arrest. It was continuity, a chain of courage passed down through actions, decisions, and the refusal to look the other way. Carol's story had taught her that. As the rose drifted out of sight, Lauren exhaled deeply, her reflection shimmering against the moving water. In that moment, the noise of the world seemed to fade, leaving only the steady pulse of the river, a reminder that truth, like water, always finds its path forward, no matter how much time has passed or how much ground it must carve through. As twilight settled over the city, Lauren turned and began walking back toward her car, her silhouette blending into the soft orange glow of sunset over St. Louis. The headlines had faded, the documentaries had moved on, but the story lived, not in the media, not in the courts, but in the quiet courage of those who now understood the cost of silence. And though Carol Dempsey's name might one day fade from memory, the principles she revived would endure, passed on like ripples that long outlast the stone that started them. 2 years after Dr. Henry Alderman's arrest, St. Louis carried itself differently. The skyline remained the same, the steel curve of the Gateway Arch, the silver ripples of the Mississippi, and the restless hum of traffic. But beneath that familiar sound, Something quieter and more resolute pulsed through the city: awareness. The Mercy General case had rewritten the city's collective memory. It wasn't just a story about crime or justice anymore. It had grown into a parable, whispered among hospital staff, police recruits, and journalists. Everyone seemed to know the outline: the missing nurse, the respected doctor, the silence that buried the truth. But what lingered most was the lesson. That silence, no matter how well-intentioned or convenient, always serves deceit. On a mild October afternoon, Detective Lauren Hayes returned to Mercy General for the first time since the renovations were completed. The lobby felt different, brighter, more open, like the building itself had exhaled after years of holding its breath. A memorial wall now stood opposite the main entrance, engraved with the names of those who had once served the hospital honorably. At its center, in unmistakably large letters, was Carol Dempsey, 1942-1966. Her integrity inspired change. Visitors paused to read her name, some taking photos, others simply staring in silence. Lauren watched quietly from across the lobby, hands in her coat pockets. An elderly janitor passed by, nodding at the plaque. "About time she got the respect she deserved," he murmured. Upstairs, in what used to be Alderman's surgical wing, a new teaching auditorium had been built, the Dempsey Auditorium. Photographs lined the hallway walls, showing nurses of every decade, their uniforms evolving but their commitment unchanged. It was subtle but symbolic. The hospital was no longer trying to erase its past. It was owning it. Lauren was there for a ceremony marking the official closure of the Mercy General Review Committee, the investigative board that had spent 2 years ensuring hospital reforms were implemented. Dr. Evelyn Malik spotted her near the seating area. "Detective Hayes," she called warmly. "I'm glad you made it," Lauren nodded. "Wouldn't miss it," she said, offering a faint smile. "It's good to see progress stick." "It's not just progress," Malik replied, her tone thoughtful. "It's healing. Institutional healing takes generations, but someone had to start it." The ceremony was brief, dignified. Among the speakers was Ruth Dempsey, now 81, her voice still strong though her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the podium. "My sister never lived to see what her courage changed," she told the audience. "But today, this hospital, this city, they remember her. Not as a tragedy, but as a truth that refused to stay buried. And for that, I thank every one of you for keeping her memory alive." Applause rippled through the room. Even the youngest interns, too young to have known the case firsthand, felt its gravity. Some wiped tears quietly. After the ceremony, Lauren and Ruth stepped outside together. Autumn had painted the trees along the boulevard in shades of amber and gold. They walked slowly to the small garden behind the hospital, once a neglected lawn, now a memorial courtyard dotted with benches and flower beds. At the center stood a bronze statue of a young nurse holding a lantern to the wind, her face resolute and calm. Beneath it, a small inscription read, "She lit the path for those who followed." Ruth touched the bronze hem with gentle fingers. "She would have blushed at this," she said, smiling softly. "She never wanted attention." Lauren looked at the statue. Sometimes the ones who don't ask for attention end up changing the world. They stood there in silence, listening to the faint hum of city life beyond the hospital walls, traffic, laughter, a train in the distance. It no longer felt like the same St. Louis. The weight that had lingered for decades was gone. Later that evening, Lauren drove north along the Mississippi River. The water shimmered under a pale moon, calm and endless. She parked near the spot where Carol's remains had been recovered, the air carrying that same chill of late autumn from years ago. For the first time, it didn't feel haunted. It felt peaceful. She pulled a small notebook from her coat pocket, her personal log from the investigation, and flipped to the last page. There, written in her own handwriting, were words she had left unfinished months before. She added a final line, "The city remembers," and that is enough. Closing the notebook, she whispered into the night, "We got it right this time." "Carol," the wind answered softly, rustling through dry leaves that danced along the riverfront pavement before vanishing into the dark. It was quiet but not empty, the kind of silence that holds reverence, not fear. As Lauren walked back to her car, she glanced up at the arch glowing faintly across the skyline. It stood as it always had, a monument to progress, a reminder of where stories begin and end. She smiled faintly, realizing that justice, much like the river, doesn't stop. It flows onward, shaping everything it touches. And though the world had moved on, within the lifeblood of St. Louis, its hospitals, its streets, its heartbeat, the memory of a young nurse named Carol Dempsey endured. Her story had started in shadows, but ended in light, not through vengeance, but through the simple act of being remembered. By the time Lauren drove away, the first flakes of early snow began to fall over the city, settling gently on the bronze nurse's shoulders in the courtyard behind Mercy General, a quiet blessing for the woman who, even in her absence, had reminded an entire city how to speak the truth. For years, these cases were forgotten. But the truth doesn't stay buried forever. Here we reopen the files, reveal the evidence, and give a voice to those who were silenced. Subscribe now and step inside the archive where time, lies, and justice finally meet. Because every secret eventually speaks.